Hello, and welcome back to Being Miraculous, a podcast by Shweta Shivraman. For those of you tuning in for the very first time, Being Miraculous is a podcast to inspire and live life to its fullest through my journey of self-discovery. Miraculous is a derivative of the Greek word miraki, which means to do an act with complete willingness, undivided attention, and wholehearted devotion. This podcast is a reminder of how we're not alone in this journey and on the simple things we can do to make this life a memorable and a beautiful experience. Hello everyone, and welcome back to a brand new episode on Being Miraculous. Today we're going to be talking about something very relevant to all of us, and we are going to be speaking about shedding the ego. And I have with me Ram Ramanathan. Ram is a builder of multi-billion-dollar businesses, including Coach Arya, where I did my coach training. With over 45 years of experience in corporate leadership, he is a serial entrepreneur and a C-suite coach and leadership trainer. Credentialed by all major coaching federations and an accredited trainer, author, and speaker on leadership, coaching, and spirituality, and I could go on and on. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation, Ram. I'm really excited about what we're going to record today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rita.
Right. So before we go into the topic though today, Ram, would you like to share your journey as well? I think it'll help set the context for our readers.
Yeah, sure. For most of my life, I've been a corporate executive, corporate leader. And there was a point in my career where I did build or helped build multi-billion-dollar companies. And I also was helping startups, and I started my own enterprises. And latterly, that is currently the last one has been Coach Arya, which we've been running for the last about almost 7-8 years. And as part of my journey at one point in time, I moved into a spiritual or a monastic journey, which lasted for about 6 to 7 years. I've been a lifelong meditator, I still continue to be one, with deep interest in comparative religions and spirituality, not in the religions themselves per se, but in the spiritual context underlying those religions. And for a while, I delved deeper into it in various aspects, especially of the Vedic context of psychology and philosophy, including Tantra and yoga and so on and so forth. And after that, for whatever reason, I decided not to pursue that with external help, as it were, with the help of the so-called gurus. Decided to sort of stay within myself in terms of internal exploration through meditation and so on. And that led in some ways to coaching, which I do believe is, to me, a highly spiritual pursuit, which is based on several meditative aspects of the journeys that I have been through, which now helps me, in a sense, to help understand myself and become better, and also help other people create that awareness in them. So in short, that's what the journey is. So I take one day at a time. What happened with a certain amount of acceptance and disengagement. I think that helps a lot. And that also probably in some ways relates to today's topic. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that, Ram. And I think a lot about the topic also came from a lot of our conversations earlier as well. And I've heard you speak about mindlessness quite a few times, and I think that's where the conversation, I thought we could talk about the ego. But before we go any further, maybe we could just start with you explaining what you mean when you say ego.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. It's very difficult to say what I mean by ego. Commonly, what is ego? What most people understand as ego is to say that someone is egoistic, as someone has ego. It's as if that person is judgmental, that person is arrogant, and so on and so forth. Either in Eastern wisdom, the philosophies and psychology, as well as in the Western, it is not quite what that means at all. So one has to delve much deeper into it to understand what that word means. I mean, the moment you use the word ego in English, The derivation is from the Latin word which just means I. So ego is just about the person, as the person thinks about that person. What am I thinking at this moment? So if you look at it from probably the oldest of the Western psychological concepts of Freud, who talked about the three states of id, ego, and superego. And what he meant by ego was that state in which you are in true reality. The id is the instinctive part, where in a sense, if you go back to another version of the brain model, the reptilian brain, where the past memories and perhaps some of the other memories are stored. And that is very, very instinctive. It's about the fight and flight reaction. It's about where you are. And the reptilian model applies to the earliest creatures which evolved, like the reptiles and the fish and so on, which just had that part of the brain. They didn't have any other part of the brain. And as evolution happened, the brain became bigger, and the central part of the brain, which is commonly referred to as the limbic brain, came into being. And that limbic brain is the emotional brain, and that is a brain which actually really is about the present moment. The sensory organs are connected to the limbic brain. The limbic brain senses everything that happens around us. So most mammalian creatures, including birds and so on, have, in addition to a reptilian brain part, they have also the limbic brain. And most of the mammals, except the primates, they would stop there. And in the case of the primates, which led to the human beings' evolution, their brain evolution from a neurobiological point of view, came into the frontal part of the brain, the frontal and the prefrontal and so on and so forth, which Freud calls the superego, because that superego is, in a sense, a critical part of the brain, or if you want to use a better word, the discriminating part of the brain, which sort of reflects and looks back and studies as to what has happened in our reality and what may need to happen differently, in a sense. And you then go into moral and ethical codes. Unfortunately, a lot of those moral and ethical codes, as well as our values, are not really as unique and self-generated as we think them to be. They are all borrowed. They are borrowed, conditioned experiences, and we form them. We heard from their parents, grandparents, somebody else, a society. This is what it is. And like so many idiots in this world think that women are inferior or somebody else is inferior. Your color makes you bigger or better, whatever it is, all those kind of stuff. So those are not any kind of inbuilt biological sort of wisdom or knowledge that is generated by us, but these are things which we sort of absorb in a way as part of our experiences, especially starting from childhood. And because they start from very early in childhood, they are coming from sources of authority who we respect. They, in a sense, become gospel. And religion is one of those, the worst form, probably, in terms of, I would say, the most dangerous belief systems are part of the religious system, which are in turn sort of modified to fit into us. So if you look at it from that perspective, starting from your question of ego, whenever you talk about ego, if you're really looking at it from a psychological perspective, you need to relate it to the id, which is the intuitive part, and then the superego, which is a more critical, judgmental part, as it were. And in between is the reality part, which is about, hey, what am I now at this point in time? What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I sensing? And then how does that correspond with my belief systems? How does it correspond with my future actions that I need to take? So the ego becomes a kind of a mediator, and that is really what Freud meant. So I'll stop here, and then we can go a little deeper into what the explanation from the ancient wisdom of the Vedas and so on.
Right. And actually, that was one of the curious questions that I had, right? There's a lot of negativity around the word ego, but if you were to look at Freud's literal translation of the word I as ego, it doesn't seem extremely negative. So where do you think the negative backlash of ego actually comes in?
I think
What
that,
part of ego
yeah,
is that?
yeah, that I think that comes from the superego, that comes from the frontal part of the brain, that comes from the prefrontal part of the brain, where we start putting in attributes to it. In some senses, when Carl Jung developed further on Freud and developed his collective consciousness approach and the multiple models where he talked about archetypes, the self, the shadow, all those kind of things. There was already an element which came into being there. There's one part of it which is your true self, which I would correspond with the Atman and so on, the concepts in the Eastern religion. And then there's a shadow side, which is always present, which is that part of it which we interpret as the arrogant ego, selfish ego, and so on and so forth, because we sort of make ego synonymous with selfish, not the capital S selfish, but the small s selfish. So that's not quite true. So Freud, I think, tried to connect, and that Freud has written extensively on Eastern philosophy as well. In fact, there is a set of speeches of his which are about Kundalini, the psychology of yoga, where he's gone into deep analysis of the tantric versions of chakras and so on and so forth. So he was very knowledgeable about it. A lot of that, in terms of his concepts of archetypes and so on and so forth, brought back a lot of that ancient wisdom over and above the Freudian model, where much of the unconscious part of it was related to sex related stuff. So in the original Freudian model of what you would call the iceberg model, everything under the iceberg was pretty much all of your id was below the iceberg, the instinctive part. Both in superego and ego, parts of it were below, parts of it were above. But there are large parts of it were still below. So, which is why it's often said that much of what we do is influenced, probably 80%, 70%, depending upon how you want to measure it, is truly driven by the unconscious, which is very true. And then when Jung delved into it deeper, he said it's not just the individual consciousness, unconsciousness, there is also a larger collective, what he termed as unconsciousness, which in many ways is not very dissimilar to the collective consciousness approach that the Vedic religion took. So going back into the interpretation of how the ancients in India, or what used to be the Vedic religion space, because this word India and Hindu itself is a corrupt Mughal word. It's a Persian word. The original word for the Hindus was Sindhu, which was, the word Sindhu just meant water. It's a river moving into the sea. And that is how that civilization happened. So if at all we want to call it, we should call it a Sindhu civilization, not a Hindu civilization. We call it a Vedic civilization, based on the knowledge that we acquired at that point in time. There, the mind was beautifully defined. This was 5,000 years ago. It's there in our Upanishads. The mind was divided into 4 parts. The first part of it was called the chitta, which is the memory. It was the manas, which was the senses. The word manas had multiple meanings. It meant the heart, it meant the mind, it meant the senses as well. And the senses were really the outward-facing elements of our human brain, which collected what we hear, what we see, what we sense, what we touch, what we smell, what we taste, etc. And those are then processed by or stored in chitta, which is the memory. And whatever we store in the memory is really, in a sense, interpreted by what is called the ahankara, which is the ego. And then there's a higher intelligence or buddhi, which allows us to think of ways of how to use what we sense and what we sort of interpret out of that. Now, literally 5,000 years later, for the first time, neurobiology discovered that these parts were very similar to what the brain today contains. The senses, we know that our visual senses are right at the back, auditory somewhere here, and so on and so forth. Different parts of the brain, mostly in the peripheral parts, for good reasons perhaps. The what is sensed is then transmitted into a part of the brain called the thalamus or the hypothalamus, which is the central part of the brain. A part of it relates to the reptilian brain in terms of long-term memories. A part of it refers to the hypothalamus, which shows the short-term memories. And there is amygdala, which is the emotional processor. And they are the first elements to respond or even react to what we sense. So in most animals, they just respond or react to what they sense. They don't think about it. A dog, if you step on the dog, it yelps or it senses fear, it attacks, and so on and so forth, despite the fact that it's been, let's say, associated with humans for a long time. So if you go into animals which are mostly in the wild, a wolf or a tiger or whatever it is, their responses are purely emotional in the moment, at the moment, what they sense and what they respond to. So in human beings, that part of it is then, it leads to whatever is being processed, whatever is being understood there, which is the memory, which is the chitta. It goes into two sets of processing. One is the ahankara, which is the ego, which interprets, like Freud says, a part of the crossover between the limbic and the prefrontal or frontal cortex in terms of understanding what it means to us, the way we are, and also about what we need to do about it in the future, which is the prefrontal, which is the buddhi, and so on. So these four elements today are pretty well relatable to what the modern theory of neurobiology is from the ancient wisdom. And within that ahankara, in the Vedic system, there were two elements to it. One is called the mamakara and the other is the ahankara. The mamakara is about what intrapersonally what you think about yourself, your own inner fears and values and aspirations, and the other is the ahankara, which is about how we relate it to other people. So in a sense, today, if Daniel Goleman's emotional intelligence model is being used, the first part of it is understanding ourselves, managing ourselves, and the second part is understanding other people and helping us to relate with those people. So if you put all together, you find that in a way the centrality of how we express ourselves, how we behave, how we respond and react, the ahankara or the mamakara, the combination of that, the ego, is probably the key, because that is what we are doing in real-time processing, either taking from the past conditioned memories or what needs to happen in the future. So everything that we do can be managed if we focus on that part, in a sense, and which is why very often we keep talking about the fact that let's be in the present moment, because that's all that matters. Because truly that's all that really matters, because it is in that present moment you are really receiving, interpreting, storing, responding, all that is happening in that present moment. A lot of it is related to what we have experienced in the past, what we have stored as memories, no doubt about it. And a lot of it is relevant to what would happen consequentially in the future. But that operative part of it, like in a computer, it happens in the moment. That's all matters. So if you're able to manage that, then you would be able to manage both your past and your future as well. So all that you really need to, if you are truly sensible, is to constantly be aware of what happens to you in the present moment. That awareness of where, for want of a better word, where your ego is, where your self is, what does it feel, how does it feel? And as a result, what do I need to do today, at this point in time, this minute, to be able to manage that, to be of greater value to myself? It's a bit complicated, but I don't know how much of it, what I said, made sense to you. But if something is not clear, please do ask me. Yeah.
No, I think it definitely made sense in the sense, correct me if I'm wrong, what I understand is that the ego is a very integral part of how we receive, assimilate and process information in the brain as well. And that is the place from which we respond on a day-to-day basis, right? So considering that ego is a very central part of how we think and how we behave and how we act. We started the podcast saying that we need to shed the ego, right? And the more I think about it, it seems quite impossible. If this is the central part of how we process, then how do you say a person can probably manage the ego then, if it is?
Yeah. No, you are absolutely right. Shedding the ego is a very stupid concept. I mean, it comes from the misunderstanding that ego is all bad, that the ego is about only arrogance, it's about selfishness and so on and so forth. That's not true at all. So it's about really becoming aware of what's happening, becoming aware of one's ego, becoming aware of one's self. For a moment, let's replace the ego with the true word, the correct word for it, which is the Latin word of I, or what you could use as a self. So even if superficially we look at it, not go deeper into the Atman kind of a concept. The first thing that we receive when we sense something is the emotions. And so if you stay with only the senses, which is what very often today the so-called mindfulness aspect of experiences are about. It's purely about the sensory aspects. And they stay primarily with the senses because that is the emotion, that is where it first lands. So you're still going to be responding or reacting. It's not even responding. You're going to be reacting in a very emotional way or an instinctive way, which is what animals do. So we are not really using any of our capabilities as human beings where there's a much larger potential in terms of the prefrontal cortex and the buddhi, which is available to us. So to me, it is about, and in one of the Upanishads called the Mandukya Upanishad, the states of awareness are being described in 4 levels. The Western mind knows only about the 3. Even Freud and Jung talked only about the 3. The 4th one is a beautiful, super aware state that only the Mandukya Upanishad talks about, to the best of my knowledge. The first one is what we call the mindful awareness, which is better than no awareness at all. You're not sitting like a couch potato just shoving chips into your mouth, watching football or whatever nonsense, but you are really observing what you're doing. You are aware of what you're reading or what you're saying, what you are doing, which most people don't. And therefore, mindfulness is very important. But the mindful awareness is a very, very early state of awareness where you are primarily focusing on what you are sensing at that point, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're touching, what you're smelling, what you're tasting. That's great, absolutely great. But it leaves out a large part of it, which is about what else can I do with that information, what I sense. And for that to, for someone to work through that, the Mandukya Upanishad talks about 2 other stages following that. One they call as something like the Freudian kind of state, which is done this subconscious state, or in this particular case, it is called the sapna or the dream state. For instance, in a dream state, you go through pretty much all the responses of what you do in a reality state as well, in an awake state. If you have a dream, be it a nightmare, be it, let's say, a happy dream or whatever, you are experiencing pretty much everything exactly the same way. In the dream state, the only difference is that the body is not affected. If supposing an animal attacks you, you feel all the emotive aspects of whatever otherwise you'll be realizing in the awake state is. But in the dream state, the only difference is that even if it attacks you, at the end of it, you do not show anything physically. So it's in what is called an energy state experience. And the third state the Mandukya Upanishad talks about is the deep sleep state, which they call as the unconscious state. But curiously, the word that they use for it is the word prajna, which means very high level of awareness. That means when you are in the deep state, there are things which are happening in your body, even though you may be physically be aware, even cognitively unaware. There are multiple things that are happening within your system, parasympathetic, sympathetic, autonomous nervous systems, and so on and so forth. And they have enormous amount of intelligence and wisdom which is being created at that particular state. So there are techniques how you can access that wisdom and that knowledge. And these 3 states are reasonably known, though not to the extent of what the Vedic psychology talks about. But the 4th state, is completely different. It is a state in which you are completely disengaged from whatever is happening in the mind, but you are able to look at it purely as a witnessing observer. That means as I am talking to you, I'm quite aware of what I'm saying. I'm quite aware of you ask me any questions. But at the same time, I'm probably placing myself as a disengaged observer, not becoming an actor in that conversation that we both have. And it seems very difficult, but it can be something that you can learn from practice. That state of awareness is what I call mindless awareness, which in Mundaka Upanishad it's called the fourth state of awareness, or Turiya. And in Zen it is called the no mind. Buddha called it the Shunya, where you are no longer in the matter state of mind and body, but you are evolving into an energy state of who you are, which is beyond the mind and matter. And so it beautifully combines today with the principles of quantum science. So if you're able to visualize for a moment, it's difficult, that like the subatomic particles of which we are made of, we are both a particle as well as a wave. The particle is matter, the wave is energy, and we are that simultaneously. So can we function in the same way as a subatomic particle would? And if you are able to even conceptualize it, and eventually there are practices, you went through the Creative Future program where you go deeper into some of those meditations. And there are meditations like Vipassana, for example, the 10-day Buddhist Vipassana experience, Yoga Nidra, and so on, which can lead you into that state. You move away from the feeling of that you are just mind and body, and you start realizing that you are energy as well. You are matter and you are energy as well. And in the energy state, while you are aware of the mind and body, the matter, you have the capacity, the capability to just be an observer or a witness to it and disengage from it. At which point, the ego in that sense, which is influenced by the superego, which is a critical, judgmental, possibly those kind of aspects of it, you can completely dispense with that. You can completely be non-judgmental. You can just listen to what is being said with unconditional positive regard to your client as a coach. And so for a coach, my personal belief and advice is that if you can evolve yourself into that state of completely be an observer, completely be a witnessing observer, without being influenced by any analytical, judgmental interpretation of what the client is saying or what you are thinking, then you could look at it in a very, very neutral way, in a very coach-like way. And the effect of that is going to be very significantly different from if you were to involve your, let's say, analytical mind, which is what very often we talk about as ego. So coming back to the starting point of what you said, how do I shed my ego? Then the relevant part of it is how do I shed the judgmental, analytical, cognitive part of my thinking process and elevate myself into a state of energy, as it were, while just being an observer and a witness, completely dispense with any kind of judgment based on any past experiences I may have had. So in a nutshell, that's really what we are looking at in an egoless state.
Right. So what I hear is that the negative parts, or the being egoistic and being self-centric, all the negative stances that we associate with ego can be managed if we were to elevate to a level of higher consciousness where we observe a little non-partially towards what's happening in our lives, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But, the question that usually comes to my mind when I say this is, while I've been practicing meditation for almost 2.5 years now, not anywhere close to that, but about, what I always feel is that while that state remains, that consciousness or that awareness remains, say, for a few hours, right? Right after you do the meditations. But the minute you go into your real life, you get a call, you get an email, you get some work-related thing or anything else that can probably disturb you from that state of awareness. It goes like that, right? So how would you say that a person can manage to center themselves and continue that level of awareness throughout their daily activities?
Yeah, first of all, let me put it this way. I don't think it is necessary for that awareness to be active all the time. The awareness is in your background. It's like if you're familiar with South Indian music, Carnatic music, there is a tanpur which is playing and the bass notes, and where the singer may experiment with various other alternatives. It's exactly the same way. There is a clear awareness within you that you are energy, you are not just mind and body, just the material part. And there is an awareness within you that I need to be careful about how I interpret my past experiences. Some of them may still be very relevant to me. So I'm trying to think of the words. I don't remember the exact words. In Sanskrit, experience has two kinds of words, expressions. One is called anubhuti and another is called, I think, anubhava or whatever. One of them actually means that even though you may have had an experience before, each time you need to go through it to experience it. It's almost like, for example, from early childhood, I know that I have touched fire and fire burns, and therefore it may be harmful to me, while it may be good in other ways. So I wouldn't go and touch something which is hot to prove to myself that it is hot and it hurts. So that memory stays with me all through my life. But there are certain other things where, yes, under certain circumstances that I have experienced something which have not worked well for me, but had they been done in a different manner, they could have worked well for me. So that is where my baggage, my past experiences would in some ways unconsciously prevent me from even trying something out. So I become very risk averse, I become invalidated. So I'm not comfortable talking to strangers because my past experiences has been that some experience with a stranger has not been good, and so on and so forth. You become a recluse and many other kinds of things. So in real life, you need to, as long as we are in mind and body, we are interacting with other people, we are in that real world, whatever it may be called, it's temporary and therefore it is Maya and so on and so forth. For us to exist, we need to be able to operate with full acceptance of the reality around us, the fact that we are, even though we may be basically made of energy, but we are mind and body as well. So that distinction has to happen. We are none of us, or let's say 99.99, whatever number of percent, we are not the Ramana Maharishis or the Ramakrishna Paramahamsas who stay in a mystic state where they are completely disengaged and their relationship with other matters of the world are at a level which are very, very different. And but you and I, if I have to, let's say, run a company, if I have to interact with people, I have to have relationships, and I have to be a father, and I have to be a husband, and I have to be a grandfather, and so on and so forth. I cannot stay at that level saying that I am energy. I have to be operating at the level where I am mind and body as well. So like you said, yes, at a point in time in a deep meditative experience, if I have had that glimmer of the truth that I am part of that energy, that realization stays with me. And therefore, the way that I exercise my awareness is in relation to that. And sometimes when situations happen differently, I have to remind myself that, look, this is temporary, I'm going through with this. And therefore, this too shall pass, So the difference that I see is very often the way I express it to other people is, like, for example, we are all aware of what a sinusoidal wave is. It has huge amplitudes and pitches. Now, in a normal state of mind, anything negative that I hear about depresses me for days and sometimes weeks. Anything joyful, I may feel, oh, I need to go and party and do this or whatever, get engaged in that. But when I am aware of who I am in the energy state, that sinusoidal wave becomes much, much flatter. So even if I hear some extremely depressing news, like news of grief or loss or whatever, yes, it does affect me, but then very quickly it becomes a flattened kind of a curve. It doesn't stay at that. So whether it is joyful, whether it is painful, sorrowful, whatever it is, the reactions are much more muted. And so I think you cannot change life. Life is going to be something which is always a mix of admixture of happiness and sorrow, and loss and gain and whatever it is. But you can certainly change the way that you react and respond to it. And that makes your life much more livable. It doesn't take you into deep depressions or most of us live in manic depressive states. And we can easily get out of that state into a much more balanced state by being able to do this.
Right. So ideally identifying that balance so that neither the peaks nor the troughs are too high or too low.
Yeah, you don't necessarily identify that balance, it happens. Because consciously, I doubt very much whether you can do it. But once you become aware that you are much more than the mind and body state, that it leads to a state of acceptance, for example. That I'm able to accept what's happening around me, because then I know in a larger sense that all this changes. Tomorrow may be a different day. Something else may happen. So I'm quite okay with it.
Right. And what would you probably say to a listener who hasn't experienced that state of awareness of being connected to that energy? Say they are still being driven by a sense of ego or a sense of ahankara. How would you say the listener can transcend?
The only question that I would ask, say, if someone says, if someone believes that that's the state they want to be in, there's nothing that I or anybody else can do. I don't want to say anything to them. But if someone comes to me and said, look, I'm uncomfortable in that state. Okay, let me put myself as a coach. I don't want to interfere in anyone else's lives unless they come to me and say, look, I need help and I'm in this state, and this is not a state of happiness for me. It's not a state of fulfillment for me. And it's not a state of joy for me. So in that kind of I can explain to them, I can sit with them and explain that yes, life as you let it happen, life is going to be irrespective of what you like. It's going to be a mix of joy and sorrow. It's never going to be any different. Whether it happens through the COVID, it happens through something else or whatever it is, we all are born and we die. And the single biggest fear is of death, for instance. But for instance, if you are able to even understand that death itself is immaterial because it's a passage, it's a rite of passage. From there you move into another state. And if you truly believe in it, then if that, therefore you dispense with the fear of death, then you can dispense with any other fear of any loss as well, or any other sorrow as well. You would be able to look at it from a perspective that, yeah, this has happened, but I'm accepting it. That needed to happen. What is the learning from there? What do I move from there on ahead? Or so that is the only way that I can explain. And if they are willing enough to listen to it, and if it makes sense for them, then they would do that.
Yeah. Right. So consciously disengage with the mind and the body one step at a time.
I would say consciously disengage from effects of the experiences that you have, which could be related to the mind and the body and the senses. You can choose to you don't disengage in the sense that you don't feel it. So, for example, if I have pain, I feel the pain. But if I look at the pain as something which is, affecting only the material part of me, And there is a part of me which is immune to that pain, even it may be seeming like a visualization or a fantasy, but it does help me. It allows me to sort of be able to cope with that pain in a much better way.
Right. So what I understand is that when you feel it but not identify with it.
Yeah. It doesn't, I mean, the beautiful example is when Ramana Maharshi was having terminal cancer and the doctors wanted to sort of administer morphine to him and says, you are in deep pain, so this is not good for you. He said, this body itself is not mine, so how can the pain be mine? Of course, he comes from an extraordinary state of self-realization. Not all of us would be able to do it. But your tolerance to pain, your tolerance to sorrow, your tolerance to negativity significantly increases. And you learn to accept, yeah, it's happening at this point in time. And I'm able to do that. At the same way that when I'm working with somebody else, and irrespective of what, let's say, the past baggage of experiences may evoke in my mind, if I'm able to stay away from it and look at it purely from compassion, unconditional positive regard as we call it, then my ability to interact with that person and be able to contribute is going to be that much better.
Right. Beautifully told. Thank you, Ram, for that. Thank you. So we usually ask all our guests a simple question at the end of it. Being miraculous, as you know, stands for living life to the fullest. And we usually ask, what does living life to the fullest mean to you? Because there are so many interpretations to that. What would your take be on that?
Look, there are multiple ways of looking at it. I very often talk about needs and wants. The needs are very basic for even if you go through the Maslow's hierarchy and things like that. But unfortunately, we convert our needs into wants. The wants are what we believe we must have because we look at other people. If someone has something, what I think is better than what I have. A simple example is, if let's say I'm a villager, I'm walking, and if I see somebody going in a cycle, I would like to have a cycle because it seems better. If I have a cycle, I see someone in a scooter, and so that is better. If I'm in a scooter, a car, and so on and so forth. So a want is pure greed. It's greed which never stops. It expands. Whereas if you are able to sort of, in a sense, live with the basic needs of what you have, it may be at various levels depending upon what your availability is. I think that's the only way that you can sort of be happy. The moment the greed enters the picture, there is also fear, and the greed and fear are what take over our lives. Now, given today's context, that information is bombarding you from everywhere, and then that you need to have multiple things which perhaps you don't need. All you are really in need of is perhaps enough to sustain yourself in terms of 2 meals a day and have a shelter and clothing or whatever. So it's not always going to be possible for you to stay within those very limited boundaries of need, like a mendicant, a monk, or a sannyasi or something like that. The next best way that I find is possible is, if I'm seeking something, that I'm looking for something which is more than what I really need, which I feel could be a want. Does it have a benefit for someone else as well? Can I look beyond myself? So if I'm asking for something, is that ask not only for myself, but for someone else? So once I start looking at myself as a part of a larger community, a larger continuum, where whatever I seek is also going to be of value to someone else. And I think that makes a huge difference in terms of, let's say, one's own perception, happiness, and everything else. So I'm not just seeking for myself. I'm not just seeking that I become a millionaire or a billionaire or whatever happens, but can I do something with what I have with other people? So the wealth and power and everything become enablers to satisfy the needs of multiple peoples, not just my own wants. I think if you're able to reach that level, to a large extent, probably we can be more fulfilled. That's what I believe in. And the second is stay in the present moment, accept who you are, what's happening to you at that particular point in time. These are the possible methodologies of being happy and fulfilled if you can.
Right. Beautiful message. Thank you so much, Ram, for being a part of the conversation. I always learn a lot every time we converse, and thank you so much for being a part of Being Miraculous.
Yeah, thanks. I'm quite grateful for talking about this, but a large part of it, even as I think back on what I said, it's, I don't know. I mean, it's going into a different space. It doesn't necessarily make sense the first time around. You need to think about it. So if at a later point in time, you need a session 2 in terms of more explanations from any of your viewers, please let me know. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that time. Thank you.